Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each week we have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and architectural thinking. We are interested in what architecture in the city has been in the past, what it is today, and what it could be in the future. Today I'm having a conversation with two University of Washington professors, Hou and Manish Chalana, who are in the programs of landscape architecture and urban design and planning here at the University of Washington. And they have recently co-edited a book on what they're calling messy urbanism, understanding the other cities of Asia, where they make the case of how the mess or the informality or the complexity and the layered, negotiated character of a city and its activities is necessary and important for making a vibrant urban experience. So, Manish and Jeff, welcome to Architecture Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have just published a co-edited book called Messy Urbanism, Understanding the Other Cities of Asia. This is very weird. Why would we want to defend, describe, and write a book on a messy city? Versus what? I mean, what is it? Are we arguing against something, or is there something endemic and intrinsic to the idea of mess that is important? Manish, what do you think?
I think we're not arguing against the modern city or a planned city or any city for that matter. We're trying, through this work, we're trying to understand the complexity of messiness in the context of Asian cities, position it so others who may not be in Asia or who are unfamiliar with these cities begin to understand it and see it more clearly.
So I'm trying to think about a mess. And the image that immediately comes to my mind, and this may be a cliched image, but nevertheless, let's go with it, is that fantastic video of the Mekong Express market in Bangkok, where we have this commuter train, electric commuter train. On the tracks, there is a vibrant informal market, and which miraculously makes way for the train as it passes through, and then sets right back up. Jeff, is that the mess we are talking about? Is that the kind of things?
That's the kind of thing we're talking about, but that's also a case in which what appears to be messy is actually extremely organized.
Oh,
right?
you're saying the mess is organized?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's messy because it's not following the kind of structure and order that we come to associate with a urban space.
I see.
A typically planned urban space.
I'm
wondering why you consider that is a case of kind of messiness as well. And if you look at the example there, how things move away in a matter of seconds.
Right.
Almost everything is on some sort of mobile structure.
Right.
Things could be unfolded and folded.
Folded, unfolded, laid out, unlaid out.
It's extremely well choreographed.
Okay,
right?
so that's a nice word, choreographed.
Yeah.
What distinguishes choreography from traditional planning?
Yeah, choreography has a temporal dimension. I think is often lacking in a kind of formally planned kind of urban space.
Right.
And it can change. It can evolve depending on the circumstances. It adapts. Right. To things that are happening that could change from time to time. And so it takes on a different kind of organization.
There are multiple layers of order in this system. If you begin to think about it, they exactly know when the train's coming, and everybody knows when to move things away from the train. And they have to have the shop fronts and awning on some kind of movable system so that it goes away, and then it comes back. And then even in the way the shopkeepers organize along the track. There's also a system to that. They know where you need your spot or how you share spots during different times of the day.
But these are all the wrong words. You are saying this is ordered, it is systematized. So make the case for the mess for me then.
No, so the messiness we're talking about. I mean, I think we use messy urbanism as the title for the book. I mean, more to probably provoke, and also to play on the word itself, right? That there's a certain kind of imagery that we tend to associate with this word messiness, and we're actually interested in kind of challenging that kind of perception.
Right.
So what we may consider as messy is in fact quite order, but it takes on a different kind of order that we normally would understand.
So it's a sort of a different world, and I thought it was very interesting that to evoke and get into what the affect of that other kind of an order is, you resorted to the idea of filmic narrative. And in your introduction, you talk very beautifully and persuasively about the description of the chunking market in Hong Kong in Wong Kar-wai's film. I thought it was interesting that you contrasted kind of the speed, complexity, agency depicted in the film with the apparent kind of orderliness of the actual chunking market.
Right.
But then you went on to say, no, actually the apparent orderliness of the market actually belies a complexity which is, in a sense, I suppose, actually properly represented by the film. If we are trying to capture other orders in the urban experience, what are our technologies for capturing that? What are the techniques for representing it other than the traditional? Because the traditional don't get it.
Well, one of the things, I mean, speaking of Hong Kong, one of the authors in the book, Michael Hsu, this wasn't part of the book, but he actually had one of his doctoral students work with him to do a time-lapse film, a video of a pedestrian bridge in Mongkok, in which they document how activity on the bridge changes over a course of 24 hours.
Right.
And in which you can, because it's compressed, so you can actually see things evolve within a matter of minutes, which kind of heighten the contrast that you don't actually see if it's just it's unfold in the regular kind of time frame.
Right.
So that's one of the things I think technology could actually help.
Time-lapse photography. Certainly filmic narratives. I think certain kind of notions of collage might also capture these kind of ideas of urbanism.
Some way to integrate temporality with space, whatever means of representation that might be, would capture the complexity of messiness, if you will. Right. And I am thinking of was it Charles Correa who did the street sections in Bombay? Mumbai, right? Yes. So in the night, the streets are very different. How people organize it to sleep, and in the morning, it has a totally different life. So the temporality of those sections was such an eye opener for me as an architecture student, because we were not taught to do sections using time.
That's right.
You were just taught to do building sections.
That's right. That's a fantastic kind of landmark Charles Correa proposition, that if you look at the life cycle, the daily life cycle of the sidewalk, and in a sense regularize and formalize it, you get a completely different notion of what a space and a city is as an event, as a sort of a sequence of events. I mean, would you think the sort of Bernard Tschumy's concept of event city begins to capture some of these ideas? The city as the concatenation of space and time, which then could be called event.
Mehrotra's concept of kinetic city also gets into that direction.
That's right.
So a lot of people are talking about this to sort of understand time and how it interfaces and plays with space in cities, and the kinetic city is taking that idea further.
Let's say event or kinetic city, this idea that there is time must be taken into accord is true actually all cities. cities, right? So let's push this a little bit and say, what distinguishes this in the case of the Asian city that you're trying to talk about?
Well, I would go back to Bernard Truman's Event City as kind of a point of reference. I think there's a certain kind of romanticization of this kind of unintended, events in the city.
Right.
But I think we're talking about something different here. I think we're talking about, again, going back to this notion of a choreography. Choreography, things that are actually organized. They are not unintended. They're actually quite intended, but they don't appear to be so because of the way we might be biased against seeing certain kind of things. So I think that's what we're getting at. Not the kind of
not the accidental city,
right? Not the romanticized notion of events, but more the kind of the more everyday, the vernacular, kind of activity that takes.
That's fantastic. Yes, because I think in the West the idea of accident and the idea of the city as fully organized, the best city as that which enables the free agent citizen to do whatever he or she wants is kind of a utopian ideal, versus thinking about the city as actually another kind of organization which actually requires you to be on your feet in time and exact, rather than totally, in a sense, free.
Right. It's something that you have to negotiate, highly negotiate with interaction with different actors. It's really how groups of people operate, rather than this kind of single individual doing almost like anarchist, notion of in urban events.
So the theory, if it sort of starts to push this into the future, and if we start to speculatively start making the argument that the Asian choreographed messy city is the template for cities for the future.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it would offer a template for the future cities, because it has inherent complexities that work in certain sort of local context with local populations, and so I'm trying to understand whether we could manufacture messiness. I doubt we can do that, or should we be even doing that?
But we can choreograph it.
We could choreograph it, of course. But then by doing that, we're taking away some of the agency and the inherent qualities that produce that messiness. I see that as a process of choreographing it. Might also be a process of sanitizing it to some degree that might take away from its inherent qualities.
Could be, but the point being that clearly in the future, the Western city is not the model to build our cities in the future. We're in search of alternate models. Now, either we go towards, ecotopic visions of grand, fantastically figured out net zero cities or something like that. Or the other, what it seems to me, the model about thinking about these things is that when we look at the Mekong market, or when we look at these self-choreographed situations, one of the key things about them is their extremely optimized use of resources, right? Hyper-optimized use of resources. And it seems to me in that sense, these may be, if not templates, at least pathways towards what a city will have to become. If we are going to sustain, whatever the number is, 6 billion in cities in the next 20, 30, 40 years. Is that a possible way to think about this?
Yeah, I think so. I agree with what Manish said about kind of you want to kind of avoid planning the unplanned in a way. But I think if you picture the future city as having the kind of density that we see in Asia these days, that does require...
Which it will.
Which I hope it will. Which require a much more intense negotiation of space so that you can pack in as many activities as you can, in the 24-hour cycle that require, the kind of negotiation that we are not accustomed to. And I think that's something we can learn from the kind of choreography that we see in Asian cities today.
Right.
And we're already doing some of that. Certainly in the case of density,
right.
We're now agreeing that it's a good idea to densify cities, especially Seattle, right? So we have multiple planning and policies that are encouraging urban density. So we're permitting ADUs and DADUs, which are detached accessory dwelling units, right? We're allowing attic apartments, and then with HALA,
right?
We're bringing in additional density and tying it with affordability. So there's some of those things happening. The lessons from messiness, if you will, the density is one piece that I think we can learn from, because in this culture in the West, certainly in the US West, we've shied away from attached dwellings, and we have this ideal of a single family detached unit. And I think we're sort of moving away from that a little bit as a culture, and are more fine with our neighbors, sharing a party wall with our neighbors. So I think there are lessons out of the messiness, especially from the point of view of sustainability, that we can pull out as templates for.
Yeah, but it seems to me, I mean, we still got a long way to go here in Seattle. Let's stay home before we can see our light rail become anything like the Mekong Express, right? Right?
It may never happen.
It may never happen.
But imagine that vision. Imagine that vision, right? Why? I think we should not quickly say it will never happen. Here we are open to speculate. The question that I wanted to say, I mean, as you were saying, maybe the problem, we are moved to think this may never happen because everything is governed by a certain idea of formal planning here in Seattle. But if we were inspired by Mekong and the mess that you're talking about, and we were imperiled to think that this is a necessary and urgent thing to think about the future, what would be things one could do here in Seattle, for instance?
Well, if you look at
to move us in that direction, yeah, go ahead.
If you look at the trend, I don't think we'll see exactly the kind of
not exactly
here, but I think if you look at it as an example of sharing a space, right?
Yeah.
So the train track being shared by the marketer, the customer, the train,
right?
As a form of infrastructure, the passenger. I think one thing I can see in the future is that more of these kind of sharing occurring in urban spaces in multiple cultural contexts, and we can the same street can be used for multiple layers of activities.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, we do. We close our streets. We do street fairs,
because of
street
streets,
markets.
we now have the parklet. We have complete streets. Not to the same kind of intensity as we see in some of the Asian examples.
So, is it just a question of intensity, Jeff? Or do you think there's a sort of a DNA problem in thinking about these things?
There is a DNA problem. There are different kind of legal systems and cultural norm and things like that.
Yeah.
Things that may be acceptable in one cultural context is not in another. So I don't think that can be changed overnight. But it's probably good that they are not changed overnight, because it takes time.
It takes time.
It takes time. It takes time to kind of adapt. But I think we are moving in the directions.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I think we're talking films, so why not? I mean, one of my most mind-blowing scenes was in the original Blade Runner. Mm-hmm. LA 2025 or some 26. Mm-hmm. And that scene of Harrison Ford in the LA street with all that informal market right in the middle of an imagined future LA, which feels like downtown Tokyo or something like that. Mm-hmm. That was such a fascinatingly radical vision, I thought. I mean, we're talking early 80s.
But that vision was a reality even in this context if you go back to the 1800s, right? We look at Lower East Side, images of Lower East Side.
In Manhattan,
yeah. Right? They're totally sort of markets that you see hawkers, there are, people selling bagels, and, I think there's so much happening on the streets here.
Yes.
But then we zoned everything out and made streets just right-of-ways for vehicles.
So why can't we have Pike Place Market on every major street of Seattle?
Then we wouldn't need a Pike Place Market. And it wouldn't be that special, right?
No, why does it have to be special?
Yeah, it wouldn't be. If we had the same...
The point is not that it's special. Yeah. The point is that it's a very good form of everyday urbanism.
And we're trying to do that.
We don't want Pike Place to be a tourist place,
right.
do we?
That's what I'm saying. That it wouldn't be that special and precious as it is today. But we're trying to do that, as Jeff was saying. We're sort of heading in that direction, but it'll take, of course, time. And
we're going to need more density.
We first need more people. We need more density. Here we're talking about shrinking cities, right? Look at the case of Detroit. We're planning a shrinking of the city, right?
Yes.
And who knows, we'll have to, in our lifetimes, we'd have to think about suburbs and how to sort of dismantle them or not. Who knows how the trends of urbanization will unfold. But I think the lesson to draw from the Mekong Express market is the sharing of space, as you said. Mm-hmm. And I think we're beginning to do that to some degree. Even if you go down in South Seattle along the light trail, it's not there yet, but the planning of the nodes, the station nodes is such that we're talking about sharing spaces. Right. Again, it won't manifest in the same way as what you see in Asian contexts.
Well, that might be a good point to take a break. We are talking to Jeff Hou and Manish Chalana, responding to their recent book on messy urbanism. Listening to Architecture Talk, and we are talking to Jeff Hou and Manish Chalana about the messy city. So, we were beginning to talk about the history of the mess here in the United States itself. And Manish, earlier on you had said, or did I read it in your book, the 19th century cities were a mess. And if one can argue, an actual mess. In the West, in any way, the industrialization made a mess out of a city, and modernism and its colonially inspired logics of hygiene and so on were a response to that. Would you argue that there were things about the 19th century city which were interesting also?
It would be hard for me to argue that it was interesting because I wasn't born at the time. Our images of 19th century is very much kind of what's just been depicted.
Right.
In
squalor. It's a Dickensian world, right?
Right. But I think the kind of planned city that we're used to today, that we have taken for granted,
right,
was very much a recent phenomenon in the history of city building and city
recent
planning.
You mean what, 50, 100 years?
Recent in terms of the last century. I mean the kind of planned city that we have today is very much a 20th century paradigm.
Right.
That may have gone too far in its attempt to eradicate what was perceived as a mess in the 19th century.
Right.
Which have and the kind of planned city that we have today has the other kinds of unintended consequences in terms of decentralization, the amount of resources that it takes to operate, in terms of transportation, infrastructure, the amount of space that cities can occupy today have the kind of environmental and social consequences. And so I think it may be time for us to look back, but not necessarily to go back, but I think more to kind of fix what actually went wrong.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jeff. It's in the way we've been thinking about cities and urbanity, what we've inherited is a late 19th century sort of concept. I think Chicago Exposition sort of positions it, the city beautiful and the white city. Right? It contrasts the squalor of Chicago, the industrial Chicago, to what a city could be, orderly.
As in the devil in the white city.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So it does that, and we buy into that ideas and ideals of order and organization, right? And so we follow it, and perhaps we've taken it to the other extreme in our zoning and land uses and not being comfortable with mixed land uses and so on and so forth, right? So, and as we mentioned earlier, we're beginning to sort of now reflect on that and change some of that, but the process will take a long time. And there was a lot of benefits, I think, in the 19th century U.S. cities. One, of course, we were able to achieve mid-rise, high-density neighborhoods, which are, from our perspective, more sustainable. They did not rely on.
But are they more messy?
They are. Yeah, they were also messy in the sense, spatially more messy than
the suburb.
Than the suburb, And at that time, even the suburbs were coming up, right? The garden suburb movement was happening.
Right. But let's move this in a little more cultural dimension. And you talked earlier about, of course, we don't have enough people in the cities. We don't have the densities. We don't have the numbers, perhaps. Perhaps, Central Park in part was made to move out all the Irish and Italian squatters and the African American squatters. It was made to clean them out. The history of racial segregation and cultural segregation is an endemic part of the planned character of the American city, right? I mean, we just bought a property here in Seattle where it has an old covenant, that black people weren't allowed, African Americans weren't allowed. They were, written right there in black and white. It's just unbelievable.
They still exist.
It still exists. It's just ignored, but it's still on the property deed. And contrasting that with the vision, back to my favorite Blade Runner image, with all this Asian food everywhere. And in the context of today's charged discussions around immigration in the country, I think the messy city also implies a certain kind of a cultural vision. Beyond certain metrics of density and mixed use and so on. Would you argue, would you say that a kind of a cultural heterogeneity is necessary for that kind of a negotiated mess?
Well, I think one of the things that we wanted to really kind of tackle in the book is how the notion of messiness is really kind of politically and culturally conditioned, right?
Right.
That one particular conditional phenomenon may be considered as orderly by a certain group, but is considered messy by another group. So these are really kind of laden, perspective, and oftentimes is the marginalized, the social group, and their lifestyles and the places they occupy are often considered as messy from the mainstream society's perspective, and therefore they're often the ones that have to be, eradicated or regulated, or
But are you arguing that they bring a richness to the city, which would lead to the argument a certain amount of marginalization is necessary?
Well, I'm not saying that certain kind of marginalization is necessary. I'm saying that we have a tendency in our culture, and I think no matter which culture they are, to kind of marginalize certain kind of phenomena. And it could be because of racial, discrimination, in the previous time, or even continued today. But these, I think, are part of the social structure that I think produce these what we know conceptually as messiness.
Right.
And along with the concept of messiness comes, stigma, comes prejudice, biases, and tension and conflict in the society that could be better addressed.
Yeah, and that's true. For instance, I've seen, at least in India, I imagine it's probably true in East Asia, Taiwan, etc. also. People who have been used to living and benefiting from the mess of the Asian city will very happily move into a gated suburban community and think of that as upward mobility, right? And take out the vibrant messiness of a city and see that as progress. So, what I'm saying is that the same kind of discriminations, of course, also work throughout the world, right?
Yes.
In the context of India, we, and perhaps other parts of the world as well, we otherize the non-planned city. And because of that, there's stigma attached to it, because we feel that, those are centers for disease and unhygienic living conditions, and something we understand as or categorize as slums in India. Right? But then, as you're saying, that the middle class benefits from that urban condition because they rely on those populations for almost everything. Right. The city will shut down if those populations just decide to pack and leave. And none of the middle class, I think these populations subsidize middle class is prosperity.
Well, but the middle classes in India imagine that they want to make Ahmedabad into Seattle. See?
Right, they're trying to do that.
What's wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong. There is nothing wrong with that if it's an inclusive process.
But Seattle is not inclusive.
Seattle is also not inclusive. Yeah, you have a point. Yeah, Seattle is not.
But what I'm saying is, from a middle class Indian imagination, they want to make Ahmedabad into Seattle. Yeah. And so, what is our argument against that?
Well, I think they're trying to maybe make Ahmedabad into this imagined Seattle.
Right.
The actual Seattle may be messier than their imagination. And we have messiness in terms of the kind of social problem that come with prosperity, right? The homelessness, the disparity between different populations, the traffic congestion that we have.
Right, but still, from a devil's advocate perspective, it's so easy to navigate Seattle compared.
Oh yeah, right.
Compared to, let's now talk about the other mess of the Asian city. My God, I won't go into Delhi anymore because it's just impossible to do anything in the city. We have to take into cognizance the real mess of the Asian city.
If you bring in the density of Delhi into Seattle, Seattle might start appearing like population density of Delhi into Seattle. Seattle might start appearing that messy, and you may not want to enter Seattle also.
So we don't want that density.
So no, the density. If Seattle had the density of Dhaka, then we would only need 10% of our land that we use right now within city limits.
Okay, so
we have 90% free for everybody.
And if it had the density of Delhi. Granted, this is sort of urban level resolution, so things vary at the micro level. But if it had the density of Delhi, it would be only 20 to 25% of land needed for the whole population here.
Right.
So then we could have, the rest of it would be free.
But do we want Delhi?
Do we want Delhi in Seattle?
Do we want Seattle as Delhi?
No, I don't think it's a comparison or it's wanting one urban condition to be in another setting. I don't think that works, or we would even aspire for that.
I'm going back to my Blade Runner image, sort of a spliced image visually in narrative of downtown Hong Kong spliced into LA sounded fantastic, looked fantastic.
But a certain amount of vibrancy, of course, would sort of enliven the city of Seattle. At pockets it's dull, you don't see people around, and, so a certain amount of that would certainly sort of, revive public spaces.
I hear what you're saying, and I think this is a key point that, of course, we don't want to romanticize the mess either, right?
Right.
Do you talk about this in the book, or do you imply it, that in what ways is the mess fantastic and fascinating, and in what ways is it not? Right? Isn't that a key point?
Right. We deliberately try not to romanticize and critique, this typical kind of romanticization of the informal. I think they are deep constructual issues that we need to address. This question about slum, there's a tendency to kind of, again, romanticize how people were able to, make use of very little resources.
This slum pornography is a problem.
Right, the slum porn is problematic.
It is problematic.
And there are deep structural issues that, in terms of social segregation, in terms of social immobility, people cannot get out of that kind of situation.
Right.
And so again, we are trying to look at how these phenomena are. It's not just about density or spatial organization. There's kind of deep, kind of political and social questions,
and I would argue cultural questions.
The cultural questions too.
So we're trying to, at the same time, not romanticize or fetishize or aestheticize urban informality on the one end, but also not try to regulate it on the other. Essentially, planners and designers are always looking at it from two bookends. Either you think, oh, this is great, how they've been able to put together their entire settlements that function with so little, resources. And on the other hand, planners would always want to formalize the informal because, it's messy, it's disorderly, and it needs... and granted, there are lots of issues as you're talking about, but we don't want to sort of, just hinge our understanding to the extremes because there's a lot in between. There's a lot of complexity and perhaps lots of, if you're solution driven, there are perhaps many solutions in between, not on one end or the other.
That's right.
Yeah, I think we're more interested in the mechanisms. Mechanism, how things work. What makes some of these...
the choreography. We're back to the choreography.
Work in a way that is not supported by the current systems of planning, right? So I think if you look behind those phenomenon, there's a degree of kind of organization, self-organization. Like people negotiate, they form some sort of network.
Right.
They communicate, in ways that is not facilitated by the typical kind of legal and institutional channels.
Yes.
It's a mechanism that recognizes the agency of individuals.
And communities and groups.
Community that we can all participate in making
recognizes
something happen.
And brackets it. Because negotiation is a process of saying, well, it's not just about whatever you want.
It's not just free for all.
It's not a free for all. Yeah.
Right. You have to more of organization that require negotiation among individual and collective bodies, and it require people intermediate kind of actors who can go back and forth between multiple groups, and that's the kind of things that I think we should be looking at it and perhaps study
and augment and.
Right.
I mean, so the big question in Seattle is density, homelessness, and how do we deal with disparity. But also the other sort of at a high altitude, even higher altitude question is, as big money moves into the city, how could these processes be deployed or put into place to negotiate between the city as it is today and the city that's, coming in with the new money in Seattle. Seattle's, are we, the general question is, are we going to just become San Francisco, go exactly the same way? And so far, honestly, it looks like that's what's going to happen. Correct? How could, this choreographed negotiation that you all are talking about, is that a model for thinking about how one could think an alternate future for the changing Seattle?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at, if you just kind of explore this question of negotiation and maybe use that as a basis to develop kind of alternative, living arrangements, right? That young people could stay with older adults who have rooms in their homes, things like that are more kind of self-organized.
Uber rentals.
Something like, well, we have Airbnb already as a model. And rather than this kind of top-down, we have this, in Seattle, this kind of grand bargain. Basically, we require a developer to put in a certain percentage of, affordable housing units.
Quote-unquote affordable.
Yeah. In exchange for, higher density, which basically just make things even more affordable for, most people.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing negotiated there. I mean, it's just a SOP, it's just a...
Right. And that's was supposed to address our housing problem. Yeah. And with just one single solution. Right. There's more complicated than that, but I think we also need to look at how people can self-organize and come up with different ways of addressing the housing issue.
How would they have done that in Hong Kong? How would they? Let's cut paste Taipei or Delhi, culturally speaking, into Seattle. This is purely counterfactual, I know, but nevertheless, what could one radically, just imagining blue sky, could we do different?
Well, in Delhi, as you know, in India, the state takes responsibility for social housing to some degree, and you could argue that it's not a successful model also. But here in Seattle, we've also been trying micro-housing, we're trying tent cities, we're trying different ways of different readjustments to the housing conditions and perhaps address problems of homelessness. Have we achieved much? I don't think so. The problem is growing rapidly because of our weather and our more liberal sort of climate. The transients are attracted to be in the city, and that's only going to grow. So there's some level of informality or messiness, if you will, is already coming into the city, right? You see tents around, parks and other places. So there's some kind of messiness that the city has to now address. But their reaction would be to sort of move them to designated, areas where tent cities are,
or find good housing,
for them. So
if you find good housing for the homeless people, then all the mess goes. No, but what I'm saying is, culturally speaking, what could we imagine? The Pike triangle, which is sort of housing, building central right nowadays in Seattle. Everywhere is, but that's certainly one place. Or the light rail corridor moving to the south. Culturally speaking, where there is a diversity of peoples, actually, where new immigrants into the city are settling into those areas, right? There's sort of the rich Amazon folk settling into Pipeline area, and the other diverse population settling into the southern corridors. I mean, what kind of agential, participative, human-centered things could you imagine which could be done in a way that are different from today, as learned from the Asian example? What would those be?
Well, I mean, I think one of the problem, the housing crisis in Seattle is that 80% of our land is zoned for single-family housing, right, and which means very low density, very little mixing, very little kind of messiness, if you will, and that is a cultural question. Aside from individuals kind of protecting their own interests, and if we can demonstrate that higher density living is a desirable arrangement and is and would enable it to resolve the housing crisis to some extent.
And what if we sort of designated that all land at a certain distance from all light rail and areas is free vending zones? Like we have sort of a music law for musicians, street musicians. We could have a sort of a radical law for free vending.
It could be job opportunity for homeless people, right?
I have pictures from South Seattle that I can share with you where I've seen people selling live ducks and chickens.
Right.
Yeah, so there's a lot of informality in that regard going on already.
Yeah.
I bought chilies and tomatoes last summer from a lady who was just sitting there on the sidewalk, just like you see in India or other places. And there were 4 women hanging around her and haggling over price. Right, so that kind of informality, in South Seattle.
Right.
So you see that we need to be thinking about making the city sort of creating spaces in the city for such uses. Again, not to orchestrate it too much.
So how do you semi-choreograph something like that?
Yeah, so because the city could then say, okay, this is an area where you can do informal vending.
You can do anything.
Which there is also night markets and all that. You're thinking about it, right? So that's also fine. I think it's a step in the right direction. But then that doesn't bring in the vibrancy that we are sort of thinking about, the spontaneity and non-planned sort of, chance encounters and occurrences on the streets. That doesn't do that. And I think... But even to acknowledge that these uses are happening in this global city like Seattle, which is the headquarters of Amazon and Microsoft, that says people are selling live ducks, even to acknowledge it and sort of have some spaces for that would be a good start.
Yeah, I think it'd be so fantastic if we can imagine, enable, and legislate a future for a prosperous Seattle, which is different from the usual narrative, or we just don't follow the expectation of whatever happened in the other digital parts of the world.
So a prosperous city is a just city, and I think Seattle is already prosperous, but it's not just.
Well, the thing is the Asian city just?
Asian city is also not just, but I think it provides opportunities for multiple income groups to make some type of living.
I mean, I think I'm all for that, but I think even as a halfway stop, at least have a vibrant city on the way to a just city would be, and I think there's a sort of a continuity between them.
But that would require a cultural shift. We were talking about, even in Seattle right now, I was reading just this week that the neighborhood coalitions are suing Hala.
Right. Not in my backyard.
It's sort of that not in my background idea that, bring in density but not so close to us.
Mm-hmm. So that's how we negotiate in the United States, is we sue. See, that's how we do things.
That's the culture.
That's also the culture.
Okay, moving towards the end here. So I'm just trying to theorize, what this implies as a vision for the city. You mentioned briefly in your introduction of thinking of perhaps, theoretically speaking, post-structuralist ideas of heterogeneity, indeterminability, undecidability are useful theoretical constructs to begin to think about what this vision of the city is versus, a lucid utopian planned city. I mean, what do you think of the idea of the palimpsest as a descriptor of what a messy city would be? Do you think that's a good starting point for a theoretical framing for this idea?
Yes, I think palimpsest in the sense that there are multiple layers, right?
Where all layers the layers aren't erased.
Right, layers are not erased. I think in the typical kind of planned city, there are not enough layers. I mean, most of the layers are formal kind of institutions that regulates and dictates what needs to happen. In the city that we looked at in the book, there are more layers, but more also kind of informal layers that operate kind of in between, the formal layer that provide additional kind of looseness, right, that one can begin to negotiate, and zones that are kind of flexible, that that will open up kind of opportunity for a different kind of spatial arrangement, right, and that's the kind of layer I think we need to have more. In the planned city, whether it's in Asia or in other places in the world, the room for negotiation, I think, is what allow for adaptation.
Right,
things happens as economy booms or shrinks.
Right,
those are the spaces that enable people to adapt in terms of their housing needs or room for kind of microeconomy. And I think that's what could be possible.
Right. I think that's right. How to negotiate and choreograph the palimpsest of the city. It's been great talking to you, Manish and Jeff. Thank you for being on Architecture Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, and our show's producer is Sadie Wechsler. Architecture Talk is available on iTunes, on Spotify, and numerous other platforms that carry podcasts. If you enjoyed listening to Architecture Talk, please do remember to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time.